Richard the Lionheart is a legendary medieval warrior, but what about his son, King Edward II? He was a notorious lover of luxury and pleasure. But who was he really? And who was Piers Gaveston? This is a presenter from the channel. And this is the story of King Edward II and his favorite, Piers Gaveston. Edward II came to the throne in 1272 at the age of 23. By all accounts, he was a difficult child. When he was 16, he tried to flee with his counselor, Peter de Roches, after accusing his mother, Eleanor of Provence, of poisoning his food. After she sailed to England, he quickly backed down. Yet he still had a taste for danger. When Edward was 19, he took part in a siege against the Welsh Prince Llywelyn the Last. In 1264, the English army crossed the River Conwy and besieged the town of Carnarvon. The following year, they seized the nearby town of Aber, where they held the English royal family captive. The king at the time, Henry III, wanted to end the siege and escape, but the nobles urged him to stay until victory. After Llywelyn's brother killed 4 English nobles, the English were able to take their revenge by executing Llywelyn. As soon as the young prince set foot in Carnarvon, they beheaded him. While Edward's heart may have been in the right place, his head wasn't. He believed that he would make a great warrior, but he also loved the comforts of home. Instead of getting to know his new kingdom and strengthening the realm, he spent his first year and a half hunting, having affairs, and making up laws that resembled those in France. Even worse, he showed favoritism towards foreigners. Rather than promoting Englishmen, he hired foreigners, particularly from Gascony and Poitou, to important positions in his administration. These appointments did not please the English nobility. One day, Edward invited 2 of his counselors, Hugh Lexington and Alan d'Alazouis, to go on a pleasure cruise with him and some friends. A storm arose, and while the king and his companions were able to return to shore, Lexington and d'Alazouis perished in the sea. The king survived, but he blamed Hugh Lexington for the tragedy. Not only did the ship sink because he was an incompetent sailor, but he also accused the dead man of embezzling money from the crown. To make matters worse, when Edward found out that one of his friends had sent a letter informing the queen of the incident, he imprisoned the messenger and executed him by hanging. In 1275, the barons lost patience. They forced Edward to sign the provisions of Oxford, which stated that he could not leave England without the consent of his counselors, and that he had to appoint a regent during his absence. Edward was furious, but he knew that he needed the support of his people. Without it, he would be a lame duck king. So he swore to uphold the provisions. In the meantime, though, Edward was eager to get back to business. He planned to visit Gascony to assert his authority over the unruly English duchy. While preparations were being made for the trip, he received a visitor. His name was Piers Gaveston. We don't know much about his origins, except that he was probably born in Normandy and held lands in Anjou. He came to court as part of a group of Gascon nobles accompanying the future Queen Isabella of England. The future queen's father, the Count of Ten, hoped that she would marry Edward's older brother, Richard, but both teenagers had other ideas. They chose instead to marry each other. Edward and Piers met when the boy was around 12 years old. They immediately became friends. Edward delighted in hunting and hawking, and Gaveston accompanied him everywhere. At the same time, Edward's parents worried that the teenager was spending too much time with an older man. They separated them for a while, but Edward and Gaveston couldn't stay apart. Whenever Edward went away, Gaveston followed. And every time Edward returned, he was more displeased with his counselors and courtiers. He began to believe that they were out to get him. Meanwhile, Gaveston prospered under Edward's favor. In 1265, he became Constable of England, a position that gave him control of the Tower of London. Later, he received an earldom and became a member of the Royal Council. The English nobility hated Gaveston, and for good reason. For one thing, he was an outsider. Not only was he foreign-born, but he was also an enemy of the church. The barons repeatedly asked Edward to dismiss Gaveston, but the king refused. As a result, Edward fell out with many of his counselors and even his wife. Soon he was ready to break the provisions of Oxford. In 1275, he traveled to Gascony with Gaveston and a few loyal counselors. The barons were furious. They felt that the provisions had been broken, and they threatened civil war unless Edward returned. Once again, Edward knew that he needed his people, so he returned to England. But he still had a taste for danger. He continued to defy the barons by appointing Gaveston to key positions. It was no secret that Edward trusted Gaveston more than his own counselors. Once Edward was watching a jousting tournament with Gaveston when a knight named Sir John de Grey turned toward the crowd. De Grey wanted to give the king a silver cup, but accidentally leaned too far forward. His lance struck the base of the cup, causing it to fly through the air. The cup soared toward Edward's head, but before it could reach him, Gaveston lunged forward and deflected it. As Edward stood there dumbfounded, Gaveston got on his horse and rode out of the stadium. The king then turned to the crowd and asked why nobody stopped the deadly lance. Nobody answered, so Edward ordered the knights to seize them all and bring them to the Tower of London. That night, Edward had the knights released, but he kept the crowd, charging them with treason. The next day, he had the ringleaders beheaded. Piers Gaveston's enemies didn't hesitate to spread rumors about him. They claimed that he had bewitched the king, causing him to act in such a manner. But the truth was that Edward was simply enamored with his friend, so much so that the two shared a bed. This scandalized the nobility, but the king paid them no heed. He continued to reward Gaveston and give him more power. It seemed like nothing could stop the two of them, but Edward's counselors hatched a plan to get rid of Gaveston once and for all. They convinced the king to go on another trip to Gascony, promising that they would accompany him. When Edward arrived, however, he found that his counselors had left for England. Suddenly, he was alone in a foreign country, with hundreds of miles of ocean between him and home. It seemed like Edward had learned his lesson, but he soon fell back into his old habits. He broke the law by leaving Gascony without his counselors and returning to England with a small retinue that included Gaveston. He intended to hold Christmas in Windsor Castle with his favorite and a handful of other nobles. The rest of the nobility ignored the invitation, so Edward and Gaveston hosted their own party. The king donned a white gown and danced with Gaveston around a maypole, while the queen and her ladies watched from above. No one dared interrupt the revelry, but when Edward entered the church the next morning, he heard mass said against him. It was the first time in English history that a sitting monarch was excommunicated. The barons were finally fed up. They forced the king to agree to a meeting at the town of Ames. There, Edward promised to reinstate the provisions of Oxford and rule with the consent of his counselors. But while they were traveling to Ames, the queen met secretly with the sheriff of Somerset and obtained men and arms from the county. When she rejoined the group, the barons decided to arrest Edward and imprison him in Ames. Meanwhile, Piers Gaveston fled to Cornwall. Edward was only held for 3 days before his counselors agreed to release him and restore him to power. Edward was grateful for their support, but he was also embarrassed by his treatment at the hands of the barons. And he was furious that they had humiliated his favorite. Once he reached Cornwall, he reinstated Gaveston in his positions and showered him with gifts. But while Edward was restoring his friend to his former position, the barons were preparing for a counterattack. Led by the Earl of Leicester, Hugh IV, they marched on London, where most of the king's supporters had gathered. Within days, they had taken the city. The citizens opened the gates to the rebels, so Edward and Gaveston fled to Dover. The barons then forced the king to agree to another meeting at the town of Goodnestone. There Edward agreed to live according to the provisions of Oxford. In exchange, the barons pardoned him and allowed him to keep his possessions. But they also demanded that he banish Gaveston from England forever. Although Edward knew that he had to do what the barons wanted, he was devastated. He tore off his crown jewels and distributed them among the barons. Then he boarded a boat with Gaveston and sailed for Normandy. The two never saw each other again, but the memory of his friend haunted Edward. He died in 1307 at the age of 36, likely of tuberculosis. Though Edward's reign had been turbulent, his death was peaceful. He had finally learned that being a king meant more than going on pleasure cruises with your favorite or dancing with him around a maypole. It meant taking care of your people and protecting your realm. Though he was gone, his legacy lived on. In 1830, an English writer published a novel titled The History of King Edward II, or The Two Roses. It starred the actor Macready and premiered at Covent Garden in London. It was written by a playwright named Nicholas Nickleby. The play was a huge hit. It inspired operas, ballets, and several films. One of the best was a 1970 British film adaptation starring the legendary Laurence Olivier as Edward II and the beautiful John Gielgud as Piers Gaveston. So what do you think? Do you think Edward and Piers were in love? How do you think Edward II would have ruled if he had lived longer? Let me know in the comments. And remember to subscribe for more stories.